I tell you what,
It's not like the olden days.
I'm Jake.
I'm Rosie.
Welcome to our first podcast on the olden days. This time, our subject is Knightmare, a children's television fantasy medieval game show that aired on children's ITV for 8 series from 1987 to 1994.
That's your favourite, isn't it, Jake?
That is my favourite ever television programme.
Can you tell us why you like it?
I was 4 years old when I first found and watched Knightmare, and I was transported into this absolutely enthralling medieval fantasy world of magic. And a lot of viewers my age and slightly older and a lot older felt the same way. There's plenty of exciting hooks in Knightmare, plenty of adventure and magic and knights and castles themed aspects that fans of such things enjoy tremendously. Now, there's already a great deal being written and talked about on the subject of Knightmare on the internet, and a lot of it by
you.
And some of it by you as well.
Yes, a little bit.
Now, in the description for this podcast, you will find links to the Knightmare website, which has a lot of information about Knightmare, the nitty-gritty, from how it was put together to what it actually entails, to a lot of the specifics about teams and rooms and everything we want to know, really. And, of course, a link to the iShield fanzine, which was set up in the direct aftermath of Knightmare ending, and ran as a couple of years as a paper publication, but then was revived by me online in 2001 and ran for another 10 years, which is an achievement I'm rather proud of. And of course you can read a lot of the specifics about Knightmare in there, as well as my own thoughts about practically everything there is to do with it.
Everything.
And there's a lot of fan work as well.
Also Jake, and sometimes I, and sometimes our friend Ross, hi Ross, and a couple of other people have done some fan commentaries on every episode of Knightmare. Jake's on all of them, the rest of us are on some of them, which you can access from the iShield website and listen to if you like to hear Jake and me and other people talking about Knightmare.
There do exist somewhere commentaries without me on them, but I don't think you can access those at the moment.
I don't think so.
And the ones I've put links to on the iShield website are in fact the ones that I did, accompanied by some people, including Ruth.
Yeah.
So as you may have gathered, we've already said and written, which is a way of saying, a lot about Knightmare already. So we're not going to sit here and go through all that again, are we?
Well, apart from anything else, it would take all day.
It would take all day, and it might be quite boring in some ways. So instead, we're just going to concentrate on one particular aspect of being a Knightmare fan, which is a ticklish one, choosing a favourite series, which I think is a practically impossible task. So we're going to have a talk about the 8 series of Knightmare and compare them.
So, let's start at the very beginning, a very good place to start, Series 1.
We don't want to sit here going into all the background of how Knightmare came into being, but we might just say that it was designed, created by Tim Child as a kind of living computer game. There were lots of sort of Dungeons and Dragons themed computer games at the time, as well as role-playing real-life games. And Knightmare was a kind of attempt to bring that sort of computer game to life in a real interactive TV studio environment, pioneering chroma key blue screen technology. Now, we've come to the conclusion, haven't we, that Knightmare's success is not really anything to do with the original concept of it being a living computer game.
No, not much to do with it. Obviously, we like to see real people going and playing the game. In that sense, it's got something to do with it. But the computer aspect, I suppose, is what doesn't matter.
Yes, and I think perhaps this is backed up in the fact that Virtually Impossible, which was maybe in some way intended as a kind of successor to Knightmare, and you can read the ins and outs of that on the various websites we've mentioned, didn't do so well and didn't last very long because there was really nothing more to it than the fact that it was kind of bringing computer games or virtual reality by then to life. But one interesting thing that you pointed out to me quite recently, I think, was that a lot of the early teams in Knightmare obviously are keen gamers.
Yes, they say things like there's a time bomb, and there's a bit where there's a massive pie, and they're saying it's a coin, and they're obsessed with picking up keys, which of course you do have to do a lot in computer games.
That's right, I never really clicked about the coin. Of course, you're right, in those platform games like Super Mario or something, there's a lot of jumping about and picking up coins, and of course keys.
Aren't I clever?
Yes, so a lot of contestants have obviously come into it with the frame of mind of, I'm going to be playing this living computer game. But I believe that really what made it successful was the interactive medieval fantasy elements. And that's certainly what's always kept me interested in it. So there was a bit of background for you, just an interesting side point. But as Rosie said, we must talk about Series 1 as a start. Now, like all first series of any kind of show or production, it's a little messy, isn't it?
Yes, I think what's right with it is everything you've just said, isn't it?
Yes.
And what's wrong with it is that it's very much a guinea pig kind of a series. They're trying things out. They haven't quite got into the swing of things yet.
And that includes, of course, the teams actually getting used to the gameplay. You'll get mistakes in that series and things not being understood in that series that everyone will take as read if they've seen episodes of Knightmare before. For example, choosing 2 clue objects from the clue room. Now, I very much doubt that anyone would nominate Series 1 as their very favourite series of Knightmare, but it certainly has to be appreciated for its place in launching the whole setup. And of course it has its classic Knightmare moments too. I do like, and now I'm going to start talking as if everyone who's listening knows all about Knightmare, so make sure you've gone and read up on it. I do find the Merlin scenes perhaps at their most atmospheric in Series 1. The snippets of level 3 we get to see at the end are very dark and evocative. I can see why it did draw in so many viewers and speak to them in a lot of ways.
The fact that the teams have absolutely no idea what's going on does mean that you don't get to see level 3 until the end of the series, which does make it extremely significant.
Yes, indeed.
Exciting, it's really been built up to, and they have that wonderful atmospheric music when Richard arrives down there.
Which of course leaves you wanting more, which is the best way the end of a series can really make you feel.
So, if you were 4 years old, I was 2 years old, so no wonder I have absolutely no memory of watching Series 1 the first time around.
Yes, and my memories of the first 3 series were very blurred and warped. The 4th series we started recording on video, but I didn't see episodes from the first 3 series again until the mid-90s, when they started being shown on the Sci-Fi Channel, but we won't go into all the ins and outs of that. But yes, they were very hazy memories of the first 3 series for a long time. So, as I was saying, Series 1 certainly left us wanting more, and we got more.
Hooray!
An extended series. Series 1 was only 8 episodes, Series 2 was 16. And, in many ways, Series 2 is Series 1, the original brilliance, with all the lumps and bumps and creases ironed out and the idea honed, isn't it?
Yes, let me say Series 2 is my favourite series. There are things wrong and things right with every series, except Series 8. There's nothing right with that, is there? But,
No.
But I always thought Series 2 is my favourite, and having thought about it in great detail over many, many years, I haven't changed my mind.
See, up until quite recently, I'd have definitely said that Series 2 was my favourite, if pressed. But now, I'm not so sure. Yes, it is all the original brilliance ironed out. As you say, every series has its problems. But the fan favourite has always been, it appears, Series 3. Certainly whenever anyone's come on the internet and written about it or started the fanzine about it, it's been the fan favourite one, which is why Challenge TV chose to buy Series 3 first off back in Christmas 2002. they thought, which series of Knightmare shall we buy to show over Christmas? Let's buy Series 3, everybody loves it. And it's easy to see why it is a fan favourite, isn't it?
Yes. Shall we explain what's wrong with Series 2 first?
Yes, please do.
And then we can explain how Series 3 builds on that and improves that. What's wrong with Series 2 is that it's not very fair. 2 teams actually win. No teams conquer the dungeon in Series 1. By Series 2 they're saying, look, we've got to have a couple of winners or everyone's going to stop watching and be terribly bored. And the 2 teams that win, they really get helped along, don't they? Their quests are easy.
This, again, is a very controversial subject, and if you care to look at the Knightmare forums and things, you'll find a lot of debate about whether certain teams, winners and non-winners, were helped or hindered in different ways at different points in their quests by the production team. But as Rosie says, I think Mark and Julian, the winners in Series 2, do have probably the 2 easiest quests of the first 2 series. You will find that a team can be helped and chivied along by not having to answer so many questions, not having to choose so many objects, having a very linear quest where they don't really have to do anything. And I think it's fair to say that Mark and Julian both benefit from that phenomenon, don't you?
Absolutely.
Obviously, there's a lot specifically to say about Mark and Julian's quest, but we're not going to do it now.
It's all been said before.
Go and hear it and read it elsewhere.
So Series 3 then doesn't have that problem so much. One of the most successful quests, Martin's quest, is arguably a little easier than the other quests. But they do have some challenges. The problem is that they stumble on one of those challenges. Series 3 is so fair that nobody actually wins.
Yes, Martin's quest comes towards the very end of the series, and it's the last chance for a winner. And it's clear to see that the production team have tried to give him every chance possible. In level 1, he only has to use 1 object, for example. Clue from the wall monster, very,
Leave the gold, for with it you may not prosper. Now let me explain to people who don't understand. You get 3 objects to choose from. So if your wall monster tells you, leave the gold, that means take the other 2, doesn't it?
Whereas earlier in the series, Dungeoneer called Kelly, if she'd had the clue, leave the gold, it would have been much more helpful than the clue for 1 object she was told to pick up.
I'll tell you just a couple of other reasons why I do prefer Series 2 to Series 3. That's not the only thing. One is that overall I prefer the characters. For instance, one of my favourite characters, Folly, the original Jester, is in Series 1 and Series 2, replaced in Series 3 by Motley, who I also like. But as a Jester character, I have to say I prefer Folly.
And of course there's a lot being said about comparing Folly and Motley, which you can see and hear and read in other places. But raising that point, it's reminded me how resistant I was when I was 6 years old and I first watched Series 3 to a lot of the new characters, some of which were direct replacements for characters from the first 2 series that I'd enjoyed and was sad not to see there. For example, Golgarach, the wall monster, replacing Granitas, which was an absolute sacrilege to me back then. So coming into Series 3, yes, it does feel a lot different. Not in terms of the gameplay and the actual dungeon rooms that they use, but in terms of the characters and the whole atmosphere. The change in Traegard's demeanour being a big aspect of that. His demeanour and his costume, which is a big part of his demeanour in many ways. First time we've mentioned Traegard.
It is, isn't it? Sorry, Traegard.
Perhaps should have mentioned him before, but then he hasn't come up. There's plenty to read about him. So.
Shall I take this opportunity to talk about my Series 3 memories?
Yeah.
It will be brief. When you first started being able to show me episodes from Series 1 and 2, I recognised absolutely nothing. I was like, whoa, what is this? Series 3, I always had ever so slightly remembered Mrs. Grimwald, who was a new character for Series 3, a couple of scenes in hardly any detail, very, very hazy, but I did remember sitting and watching Series 3.
So it's easy to see why Series 3 has a reputation for being tough, because it was. And of course everyone comes away remembering there were no winners. But I do feel that while Series 2 does succeed in ironing out the creases from Series 1 and getting the original brilliance to its apex, Series 3 does successfully take that a step further and balance out the original brilliant Knightmare idea with a lot more fantasy elements coming in. For example, the elf realm coming and overlaying the dungeon to some extent.
I do like that aspect of Series 3, the wider story going on all around.
And of course that aspect of Knightmare is very much developed in later series. A wider story, a wider environment than just the dungeon, but a whole new dungeon dimension opening out. And I think it could be argued that Series 3 is perhaps the peak of that, because it doesn't interfere with the original concept. And if your original dungeon-bound Knightmare gameplay is how you like to see the show being played out, that little bit of wider story that comes in Series 3 is probably just about the right amount that you want.
I do agree with that, actually. I like how the wider story is quite understated in Series 3. You don't get things actually happening to the elves. You don't get them needing the Dungeoneers to join in with the story. They're just something that you encounter along the way, and then the rest is up to the imagination, and I do like that, actually.
So perhaps, in terms of gameplay and atmosphere, I do think Series 3 is the best. Yes, finally I've joined that camp after all those years. However, I don't think I could ever say that it was the one I was fondest of, or enjoyed watching the most. There's just so many different aspects to what makes a favourite series of Knightmare, and I honestly don't think I can actually settle on one.
Well, one thing that I'm thinking of as well is the teams, which we haven't really talked about. If you're not crazy about many of the teams in a series, that does make a difference. I have to say, I'm not crazy about many of the Series 3 teams. I think I've got more teams that I like in Series 2.
That's true. The teams have to carry the show because it's about their adventure. So if you get a group of teams that you don't like, you're not going to come away with such fond memories of the series, which is particularly true for Series 6, we'll divert and say for a moment.
And Series 5.
So that's Series 3 in detail. Now, Series 4 has come in for a lot of criticism over the years for being too different. Too much of a sidestep from the original concept, if you'll pardon the pun.
If you're a Knightmare, you'll know why that's a pun. If you're not, you'll have no clue.
So if you've come into Series 3 and thought, Cripes, this is so different, it's not really Knightmare anymore, I can see why you might come into Series 4 and think, well,
it's not Knightmare at all anymore.
And Series 3 was.
I can see that as well. When I was young, first watching Series 4, and I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I think you were sort of the same. We didn't really notice, we didn't remember the previous series well enough, certainly after a little time anyway, to notice that it was so different. As far as I was concerned, it was exactly the same as all the other series.
That is so true. Because my memories of Series 1 to 3 were already becoming blurry, and I knew that Series 4 didn't have Lord Fear, still had Merlin, still had the wall monster questions, although of course they were coming from Oakley, who's a tree.
Mogdred, of course, the main villain who would be replaced by Lord Fear.
I thought that it was a lot more like Series 1 to 3 than it actually was. And perhaps because we did sit and watch it and record it, that's why Series 4 has always been the one I am fondest of. But I do actually think that Series 4 has a lot going for it. People hate the door monsters.
I love the door monsters.
Yes, I've always thought of them as a positive addition to the show. I do think Level 3 in Series 4 is very well put together and very atmospheric.
I think so too.
Of course, one of the many problems perceived problems with Series 4.
It's so subjective, isn't it?
So subjective, is the new forest locations branching out into the woods, which is taking the idea of leaving the dungeon and widening the dungeon dimensions, which Series 3 does start, to its next level. Now, I don't mind the woodland scenes at all, but perhaps that's just because of my personal memories of growing up and watching Series 4 and 5, and not really remembering the earlier series.
I feel the same way.
But then, of course, a related issue is the introduction of the eye shield. Not the fanzine, the eye shield, but the actual eye shield, which facilitates a lot of walking around the forest scenes. But even that is foreshadowed in Series 3 with the dwarf tunnel sequences, which people find very good and atmospheric, and yet you get to the eye shield and, well, people find it's just time wasting.
I feel that I want to explain the eye shield. I suppose we haven't explained explicitly that the Dungeoneer is actually blindfolded.
We haven't said the word Dungeoneer until then.
No! And 3 advisors watching the Dungeoneer on a screen guide him or her around, and they say things like, walk forward, sidestep to your left, which is why sidestep earlier was, in fact, a pun. In Series 4, they introduced the eye shield, which facilitated pre-recorded walking around sequences, so that the Dungeoneer was not in view. He or she would stand there not doing anything, and the advisors would just look at the shot of where he or she was allegedly going, even though in fact he or she was just in the blue studio. And as you may have gathered from that rather long explanation, that meant that the Dungeoneer was no longer being guided, which people feel, and I think they're right, was a huge part of the show and being a good team. Mind you, they were guided sometimes, weren't they?
Yes, they were. And even the dwarf tunnels in Series 3 has the Dungeoneer stand there pretending to walk for ages and not get guided. So it really is foreshadowed there. But yes, perhaps it's true that it's taken too far in Series 4. I do think Series 4 and 5 are quite guilty of wasting too much time on pre-recorded eye shield sequences taking up the gameplay. It's much better, it's cut back a lot in Series 6, 7 and 8. So in summary, about Series 4, we will always be very fond of it for personal reasons. Yes, it does have a lot of problems, it has come in for criticism, but I think there's a lot to be said for it in a positive way as well.
I mostly like the teams, by the way.
And that is a big help in leaving us with a positive feeling about the series.
The winning team, Dickon's team, is very, very watchable. I've noticed one or two things I don't like so much about the advisors. I do like Dickon, I think he's excellent. Their quest is Pip's, isn't it?
Yes, if Julian and Mark were chivied along, then Dickon's team certainly was. But there's plenty to read and listen to about that elsewhere.
I do remember being incredibly excited when Dickon won, and I was, how old was I, 5?
Yeah.
When I was 5 and I hadn't noticed that they were being chivied along, it was so exciting.
And arguably, what more should we ask for from a television show than that?
Nothing.
Series 5. Series 4 has been called a transition series. Series 5 is very much a transition series. I've often felt more than Series 4. Series 5 very much establishes the new setup of powers that be versus opposition rather than small humans versus dungeon. And it's really trying to find its feet with having plot-based adventures. And we actually did a very interesting commentary, which you can find if you can be bothered, about how the third quest of Series 5, Sarah's quest, goes a little too far in the direction of being a story about the local community in the dungeon dimension, Wolfenden, with which Sarah the Dungeoneer is joining in. And then after that they will find more of a balance between having a story going on and keeping the focus on the actual quest and the gameplay.
It is very awkward, that scene when the character Julius Scaramounger is going on about this venison that he's got in a sack, and they're trying to give him something, find out what he wants, and he's just saying, "Oh, do you want some venison?" and stuff like that. And they're like, "What are we supposed to do?" And then that's it, the scene ends and they leave. It's very confusing.
And it's fair enough, isn't it, that the team were confused by that, because it's not like anything we've ever seen on Knightmare before.
And even in future, if someone comes and talks to you about venison or what they've been up to, it will lead on to something, which this didn't.
So yes, it's very fair to say that Series 5 is a big transition. But I actually like it a lot in its setup and its characters.
I had an idea that Series 5 might be the best. This is because it's a fair series. The teams who die deserve to die. The team that wins, I think, deserve to win. The characters are good. The quests, once they find their feet and get past trying to make it too plot-paced, I think they work very well. But then, the last time we watched it, I realised there's only one team I actually like. Richard's team. All the other teams, there's something wrong with them. I find two other teams watchable. Sarah's team, as we know, they have a lot of problems. They dither over their quest objects too much, they dither over what to do with their quest objects, and they are dominated by one member of the team. And Kelly's team, the last team, is watchable. But because they're the last team, they don't really get a proper quest. All the other teams I don't like, including Ben's team, the winning team. Pickle, Treguard's elf assistant, who's introduced in Series 4, and do people not like that either?
Well, there's a whole separate debate about assistants and whether he really needs one at all, but I think it's quite universally accepted that Pickle does add a lot to the show, particularly with team interaction.
Righto. Anyway, what I'm saying about him is that he describes Ben's team as a trifle disorganised.
He's right there.
They're terrible. They don't really guide him. They don't really seem to make any decisions. They go into a room and they say, oh, you're in a room, the doors, and then a character comes along, perhaps, and says something, guides Ben through the scene. They're picking up their objects. They sort of go, I'll take them. It's very, very awkward to watch, and you're kind of left wondering how they've made their decisions. And of course, they're able to guide Ben out of the room because they don't have to. They have all the eye shot sequences. That was a bit of a rant, wasn't it?
That's very true, everything you say about Ben, but as you said earlier, I do think, despite that they're within the top two winning teams that you wouldn't necessarily argue were helped and cajoled along a bit by the production team.
However, they got to their decisions by sitting there going, oh, well, they did make the right ones, didn't they?
So perhaps they won more by luck than judgment, but I don't think they were as chivied along as a lot of others. But there we go, that's a whole can of worms.
I agree with you. The thing is that I'd rather see engaging charismatic teams, even if they are chivied along, than annoying teams. So that's the tiebreaker for me. That's why Series 2 remains my favourite.
So, in summary, Series 5, very much a transition, but successfully pulled off, and I think an improvement on the kind of let's go out into the woods and surrounding community and integrate it into the quest that started in Series 4.
Series 6 was another one. At one point I thought, well, maybe that's my favourite. It appears at first to be better organised than Series 5. I think the last few times we watched it, we noticed that they made a few mistakes in Series 6, didn't we?
Yes, but it does seem that the idea of the powers that be in the opposition is very much cemented, and the gameplay seems very sure of itself.
But I realised quite a few years ago, I think, this was a long time ago, I thought maybe Series 6 was my favourite, I realised I don't like most of the teams. Tell me something, are there any mixed teams in Series 6?
What a very interesting question, and I think the answer is no.
Righto.
They're all single-sex teams.
I don't like any of the teams of boys. They're all very annoying boys. I'm not being sexist or anything, it's just a coincidence. There are some teams of girls I don't like in other series. And who are the teams of girls? Samaya, they're okay. January, they're okay. Sophia is the one Series 6 team I'd say I really do enjoy watching.
So it is a bit of a mixed bag, Series 6. In many ways, it's a lot more assured than Series 5. But then, when you look closer, perhaps the gameplay isn't as perfectly put together as it seems at first.
Well, I'll tell you something. The winning team in that series, Ben's team, is the worst winning team for me. They make at least one mistake, sometimes more than one, on level 1, level 2, and level 3. And yet, it's quite clear, when you've watched it a few times, they are not going to lose, because it's practically scripted, their whole quest.
So you might come away from Series 6 with a bit of a bitter taste, which Rosie's obviously done.
I'm awfully cross about it, aren't I?
So definitely not a contender for a favourite series there.
No.
But perhaps the most solidly structured powers that be versus opposition series, at least superficially.
Does it get on your nerves the way they say Lord Fear all the time?
Yes. It certainly did when I first started watching the series, and everyone seemed to have to say Lord Fear every 2 seconds to very much drum into it that, look, he really is the big bad now, and everything that's happening to oppose the quest is him trying to stop it. Overdone, rather.
So that's Series 6 properly slagged off, even though, like all series, it has its merits.
Now, Series 7 is where things really start to go very awry, I think. Let's mention Majida first. A replacement for Pickle as Traegard's assistant, and a poor one, I think it's pretty much universally agreed.
She does whine, rather, doesn't she? She doesn't ad-lib and interact with the team very much.
Which is really the main problem, I think.
I think maybe it's harder for her to be herself because she is doing an accent. She's playing more of a character.
And another thing I will say in brief summary that you can hear elaborated on in many places is that Majida's interaction with Traegard I don't find at all pleasing, unlike Pickle's interaction with Traegard. And I think Majida and Traegard and their pantomime banter and arguing and bickering doesn't add anything to the show, and does take quite a good chunk away from Traegard as a host and a custodian and presenter of the show.
The thing is that Majida can't have the same relationship with Traegard as Pickle does. Because she's a woman, Traegard cannot boss a woman about and in some ways abuse her as he does to Pickle. The problem is that instead having her argue with him, that's their attempt to try and make her strong. But a strong woman doesn't have to be argumentative and contrary all the time. I think there would have been a better way to put them on more equal terms.
And again, you can hear us saying this in other ways and more in-depth in other places. Now, a lot of the problem with Series 7, I think, is we've started to lose much of the original atmosphere, setup, and magic, if you like, of Knightmare. Now, this has started creeping in Series 6, with the new over-the-top going through the portal noise, which replaced the original whoosh noise that had been there in some form since the first series. And of course in Series 6 we also got the new Life Force clock, again replacing the traditional one that had been there since the beginning. But that was in some ways palatable in Series 6 and seemed perhaps like a natural progression that didn't rankle too much. Same of course with getting rid of the original pictures for the opening music and having something a lot more virtual reality based for Series 6. Quite a few things actually that were actually around in Series 1 to 5 in some form that go in Series 6, isn't it? The music pictures, the life force, the portal noise, just things that make Knightmare Knightmare. But it's palatable in Series 6, but then in Series 7, well, the new helmet, that's a big problem. A Dungeoneer no longer looks like a Dungeoneer, and yes, perhaps it's a bit pedantic and fussy, but that does take a lot away from watching the show for me.
I don't think that is pedantic and fussy. The helmet is a huge part of it.
It's iconic.
Of course, Series 6 had a new knapsack, but you don't notice that quite so much.
You don't notice that quite so much. It's really, you want to look at the Dungeoneer and think, oh yes, Dungeoneer, Helmet of Justice, horns. It's so distinctive that getting rid of it really is a nail in the coffin. Of course, I think it's pretty much accepted that the new helmet was introduced because they wanted to have this virtual reality display for the Dungeoneer to see, which was incorporated into the quest in the form of seeing eye spells. Now that in itself is a big problem for me because it takes away from the original Knightmare concept that the Dungeoneer is blind and must be guided through the quest.
It's the computer game idea, isn't it? It's the next stage of the computer game, so Tim Child thought he'd better give it a go.
That's absolutely true, isn't it? It's Tim Child being obsessed with his living computer game idea, not realising that the show has long since outgrown it.
It epitomises that whole concept, doesn't it? What makes it successful versus the original idea of the living computer game.
So yes, I feel, and I think a lot of fans do feel, that taking it on to the next stage of computers, virtual reality, with the Dungeoneer as the player, was a mistake for the show and took away a lot of the Knightmare atmosphere, which may not have been how Tim Child intended to create the Knightmare atmosphere at first, but it's how it turned out. And of course, Knightmare's replacement / demise has a lot to do with a more virtual reality based show. So in Series 7 you really can see the rot setting in.
I do agree with all that, absolutely. It's quite true, I think, for any real Knightmare. But I'll tell you, I would rather watch Series 7 than Series 6. I might even choose Series 7 given the choice between Series 7 and Series 5. Primarily because the teams are more likeable. There's one team I don't like. In Series 6 there was one I did like. In Series 7 there's one I don't like. Actually, he has a slightly harder level 2 than everyone else, doesn't he, Ben? And he dies.
Yes, he does, and I think it's fair to say that they're rather cruelly and harshly culled there.
Because they were annoying the production team, perhaps? They were annoying me, I'm afraid.
Yes, conjecture, but we think it's true.
The first of 2 winning quests, finally a team of girls wins, on their own merits. People say girls don't do as well on Knightmare. Let me tell you something. Proportionally, they do, and the one time a team of girls wins, they are not chivvied along, unlike most of the teams of boys who win. Julie's team, my favourite team ever. Therefore, that's got to be a point to Series 7.
Yes, there is a whole other can of worms, which you can hear and read about in other places, about whether Knightmare is sexist and whether it lets on enough girls, or whether it's proportionally the same number of girls as apply. But the fact remains that Julie's team is the only all-girl winner and is an extremely good and competent and watchable and engaging team. And I think it would be very hard to make a cogent case that they're not the most deserving and least chivvied along winners of all.
The last time we watched Series 7, it really struck me how much more efficient they are than the second winning team, Barry's team. Very, very famous team for being a very confident group of boys, particularly Barry himself is a rather cocky Dungeoneer. I have mixed feelings about how much I like him.
Barry's quest in itself makes Series 7 very memorable for a lot of people, for better or worse.
But they do need a bit more prompting from Treguard than the girls. They do dither a bit more. But again, I do think that they deserve to win. So in fact, Series 7 has 2 winning quests that I consider deserving. I like the Trial by Spikes as well, and Goth, the Series 7 level 3, very atmospheric. Series 6 doesn't have a decent level 3.
Yes, and nor does Series 5 really. It makes a kind of attempt with Winteria. But that's only in Ben's quest, really. When Sarah arrives in level 3, which is the team before Ben's team, it's very nothing. Doesn't have its own identity. So in that way, Series 7 does make an improvement. And yes, the Trial by Spikes, play your cards, right, which is part of Goth. A lot of that does hark back and remind us, I think, of earlier Knightmare, which is quite nice. But it's a double-edged sword, because it's also the introduction of too much virtual reality and taking the show off in the wrong direction, I think.
As we say, all the series have their pluses and their minuses. And for me, the teams have a lot to do with how much I like them. I wouldn't like Series 7 very much at all if it weren't for the teams, I think.
Yes, and that's very understandable because it's the fact that it is an interactive adventure that you feel like you're in with the teams that makes the show so good to watch and enjoy. So you're going to want to like the teams that you're following.
Very much so.
So, Series 7, I think very much signs that Knightmare is dying, but, again, it has its good points. It has its contribution to make to the good aspects of Knightmare as a whole. However, I don't really feel that the same can be said of Knightmare's final series, Series 8.
Series 8 has an awful lot more wrong with it than right with it. I think what is right with it is down to if you like any of the teams.
Now, Series 8 was starting at a terrible disadvantage because the episode number had been slashed by a third to 10 episodes. You can read the reasons why, the ins and outs of it, elsewhere, but the fact is they were coming in with only 10 episodes and knowing that it was probably going to be the last series. Not for definite when it was actually made, but it was certainly on the cards. And I think for this reason, it turned out to be rather a mess on every level.
I'll tell you what I do like. Some of the characters. I suppose one of them, really, Stiletta, is the only character I would miss if Series 8 were expunged from existence, but I still knew about it. Who else is new in Series 8? Honesty Bartram, he's okay. Snapperjack, you and I both like the aspect of asking questions, which we haven't really mentioned. We talked about asking questions and riddles in the earlier series. That vanished. They did a little bit of it in Series 5.
Yes, it's pretty much vanished after Series 4. But again, Series 5 being a transition, you do get a bit of it.
So, the character Snapperjack, people don't like him, they find him annoying, I can see that. Asking the questions to test the Dungeoneers, that is a good aspect. It has some good locations. The Maya world is pretty good, isn't it?
Yes.
The Golden Galleon, the ship, that's nice.
I think Honesty Bartram in particular has a lot of potential as a character. But of course, because the series is so short, he, like practically every character in the series, ends up being underused. I do think it is purely because it's so short and so much is trying to get crammed in that Series 8 is such a mess. Yes, Linghorn and Marblehead, the Maya world, is a nice location and a nice kind of extension to the wider story of Lord Fear and his power plays and his relationships with other sorcerers in the dungeon. But of course there's too much trying to come in addition to this epic new level 3. They're trying to get in too many new characters, too many new creatures, too many new ideas, and a lot of new VR. Only the Goth runes remain from Series 7. It's a lot of new stuff to get used to. New concepts, new characters, new locations, all crushed in together to 10 episodes.
Some of them would have been good, with more episodes to explore them. Some of them still would have been bad. For instance, the trapdoors.
Oh, the trapdoors, yeah, it should have just been wellways again, if you ask me.
Well, I don't mind the idea of trapdoors in itself, but I don't like faffing about trying to get them open and faffing about so that you can float down safely without getting killed. If you just stood on a trapdoor and it opened and you went down to level 3, that would be okay, wouldn't it?
Yes, I suppose in that way Series 8 has some of the same problems as Series 1, almost trying to launch a whole new concept. I think it's got about 3 series worth of development, new ideas, crammed into one final series. And even with 15 or 16 episodes, that would have been noticeable, wouldn't it? But as we were saying, with 10 episodes, it's a real problem.
Other things are wrong with it. The antechamber, where the Traegard and Megiddo and the advisors all hang out during the quest, that's been completely remodelled.
Which leads to quite a lot of problems about the presentation of the show to us and to the team, interaction between Traegard and the team, interaction between Traegard and us, Tragard and Majida banter getting much worse. Again, it's all discussed elsewhere, but it's all true.
But of course, the worst thing about Series 8 is the shortcut. Introduced because teams have been getting killed off, possibly unfairly. Again, that's been talked about and written about a lot. The best team of the series, Nathan's team, the most engaging team as well, had a dodgy death, didn't they?
Very.
Which doesn't sit well with Jake in particular.
No, not at all.
And then they only had a few episodes left. They were thinking perhaps they weren't going to make any more Knightmare. They had to rush through a winner, or at least give someone a good chance at being a winner. So they introduced the shortcut from level 1 to level 3, meaning that every other team before them had to complete 3 levels, and suddenly this lot get to cut out the whole of level 2. Now, who wants to see that?
The only thing I'll say about the shortcut here and now is I have read the argument that, oh yes, the shortcut's fine. Shortcuts in computer games are an existing concept, and it tallies perfectly well with Knightmare's setup. I say again, what makes Knightmare Knightmare, for me, and I think a lot of people, is nothing to do with the fact that it was supposed to be a living computer game, but an interactive adventure where you follow the teams through and feel a part of it. And if you come away having had one of those teams win, having completed only 2/3 of the challenge, that leaves you with a nasty taste in your mouth at the end, I find, and a lot of people do as well. And that, too, is just a symptom of the series being rather too short, rather messy, and in many ways that was quite a sad note for Knightmare to end on, but there's plenty to look back on and celebrate about it, even if the end sticks in your craw. And then, of course, after Series 8, you get Virtually Impossible and the problems with which one of them, Knightmare or Virtually Impossible, is going to be renewed. Neither of them. Okay. Is Virtually Impossible supposed to be a successor? Yes. No. Definitely not. But we won't talk about that now, will we?
I don't want to talk about Virtually Impossible ever again.
So there's a summary of our main feelings about the 8th series of Knightmare. So let's go back to what I was saying at the beginning. I do think, I don't know if everyone agrees, but I do think it is hard to pick a favourite series because there are so many different aspects to think about.
I agree it's hard. I have picked a favourite series because, for me, which of the aspects I like and dislike and to what degree are quite clear. Series 2 is my favourite because of the characters, because of the teams, because of the original brilliance all still being there, in spite of the problems. I couldn't pick a second favourite and a third favourite and so on.
And as for me, I think I finally decided that I'll have to have no favourite series of Knightmare. I think after watching and analysing it so closely and even becoming quite bored of it at one point, I'm over that now, I do have to conclude that Series 3 is the best, most accomplished series. Series 4 will always be the one I'm fondest of, sitting and recording it. Series 2, I think, definitely is the original brilliance at its height, but not with the extra aspects that Series 3 starts to introduce. Series 5, I think, has a lot going for it as the new Knightmare that Series 4 starts trying to be. In no way do I think Series 6, 7 or 8 could be considered the best in any way, nor indeed Series 1, because it's a shaky start, inevitably. So, all I can have is favourite aspects of Knightmare rather than favourite series. So, we hope, as an informed Knightmare listener, which you'll have to have been to enjoy this, that we've made you think, consider, and perhaps turn over some of your own thoughts about Knightmare during this little summary. So we'd better sign off for now, but be sure to join us next time for our second podcast, which will be on the subject of Rosie's choice.
It will be my favourite, Extreme Ghostbusters mostly, but we will also talk about the Ghostbusters franchise as a whole.
So join us again soon for that podcast. I'm sure it will be riveting and perhaps controversial.
Maybe.
So until then, good night out there.
Whatever you are.